facts too shocking to be contemplated occasionally force their way to the public ear. If the laws were arranged that a master could torture an apprentice to death, would it be received with composure? Would it be said, these cases are rare? This injustice is an inherent one in the slave system. It cannot exist without it. There's actually nothing to protect the slave's life but the character of the master. Or the honorable, the just, the high-minded and compassionate, the majority anywhere in this world. On the shores of our free states are emerging the poor, shattered, broken remnants of families, men and women escaped by miraculous providences from the surges of slavery. These individuals have bravely succeeded in conquering for themselves comparative wealth and social position in the face of every disadvantage and discouragement. The story of my life is full of striking incidents. As I look back through the vista of more than 80 years, scene after scene rises before me, and ever fresh wonder fills my mind. I delight to recall it.
On March 20th, 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a novel entitled Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Harriet Beecher Stowe's goal in writing Uncle Tom's Cabin was to humanize enslaved people, to really make their life struggle understood by her white audience.
The fact that she was a white woman, growing up in an intellectual family, a family of a Presbyterian minister, gave her license to tell a story that would garner sympathy. And what she wanted to do was to give life to a collection of stories that were these freedom narratives.
Uncle Tom's Cabin was an immediate success. It sold over 10,000 copies its first week and went on to sell over 1 million copies its first year in print.
So Harriet Beecher Stowe's book was like the social media of her time. It was the television of her time. It was the great exposure of man's inhumanity to man.
By the end of the century, it was the best-selling book in the world aside from the Bible.
Uncle Tom's Cabin really galvanized the anti-slavery and abolition movement in the United States before the Civil War.
It caused a debate and discussion, both in the North and the South, particularly in New England, about the plight of slavery and the inhumanity of slavery.
The novel really got people talking, and some people even credit Uncle Tom's Cabin with getting Lincoln elected. When Stowe met the president, he supposedly said,
"So you're the little lady who wrote the book who started this great war." It not only balloons up in sales, but there's also a negative reaction to it. They really took Stowe's novel and went with the opposite viewpoint.
Copyright law in the United States was very lax at the time, and there were stage productions that used the exact same title, and there was nothing that Stowe could do about it. These blackface plays really transformed the character of Uncle Tom from this strong, noble, faithful man into this old, exaggerated, subservient slave.
In talking about Uncle Tom, we have to be careful because it has a legacy rich in racism.
Some people saw in Uncle Tom as being a compromiser, a person who sold himself or herself out, when in reality, the Uncle Tom was the person who learned how to maneuver two different worlds.
The term Uncle Tom has become this derogatory term, but really the character was never written to be that way.
Many people in the South said that Stowe's novel painted an unrealistic picture of plantation life, but Stowe wasn't exaggerating it at all. Harriet Beecher Stowe pushed back by publishing a giant book of all her sources called The Key to Uncle Tom's Cabin.
On page 26 and 27, she talks about Josiah Henson as one of the enslaved men who forms the basis for the character of Uncle Tom. Henson's life story was integral to Uncle Tom's Cabin.
When I learned that the main character of Uncle Tom was based on a real person, I had to know more. Who was Josiah Henson? How had I never heard of this man?
I was born June 15, 1789 in Charles County, Maryland, about a mile from Port Tobacco.
Josiah Henson was born into slavery on the plantation of a man named Colonel Francis Newman.
His father was owned by Newman, and his mother was owned by Dr. McPherson.
Josiah, when he was about 3 years old, he talks about his earliest memory.
The story he recounts is of his mother being brutalized by an overseer,
Which we understand is a euphemism for rape. That was a very common everyday occurrence that women who were in slavery had to endure. You had no personal space that couldn't be invaded at the whim of the white population.
Newman's overseer takes Josiah's mother to a faraway field one day and begins to abuse her, and her screams catch the attention of her husband. He sprints through the fields, and when he sees what's happening, he beats the overseer into the dirt. She begs him to stop, and he eventually relents and runs away because it is illegal for a slave to hit a white man. But he is quickly recaptured.
To stand up to a white man, particularly if he decides he wants to do whatever he wants to do with a woman, whether this woman is your wife or not. That's not your privilege.
The neighboring blacks were brought from the local plantations to witness the scene.
There were people whose entire side business was to whip and punish slaves. Newman's overseer hired a local blacksmith to administer his revenge.
He was struck 50 times on his back, and then they checked to see if his pulse was okay. And then they struck him another 50 times.
It was a lesson for everyone to know if you step out of line, that's what's going to happen.
It is incredible that Josiah's father even survived that punishment, but they then nailed his right ear to a tree, grabbed a sharp knife, and cut it off.
To be whipped to the point where your bone is exposed, or to have your ear nailed to a post and then cut off, these things are not uncommon.
Josiah's father bursts into the cabin. He is screaming. The fellow slaves would have had to cauterize the wound to prevent infection. This is Josiah Henson's first memory.
Josiah sees multiple things. He's seeing his father be heroic towards his mother. He sees his father being beaten for that. And he eventually sees his father being sold.
My father had been a good-natured and light-hearted man, the ringleader of all the fun at corn huskings and Christmas buffoonery. His banjo was the life of the farm, and all night long at the merrymaking would he play on while the other Negroes danced. But from this hour, he became utterly changed, sullen, morose, and dogged. Nothing could be done with him. He brooded over his wrongs. The milk of human kindness in his heart was turned to gall. So off he was sent. His afterfate, neither my mother or I have ever learned.
The term sold south means that you will be sold into Louisiana, into Mississippi, and the fear is that you'll be separated from your family. You will be separated from all that you know and love, and that you will be worked to death.
In 1808, the United States Congress abolished the international slave trade, which gave rise to the domestic slave trade that triggered the forced migration of more than 1 million people to the Lower South through the course of the antebellum period. As tobacco became far less profitable and the land became exhausted from repeated tobacco cultivation, you had this massive forced migration of what was considered a surplus labor force out of the Upper South to the Lower South. The labor being performed in the South, especially within the plantation environment, within cotton fields, sugar fields, it's a very tough situation. It kind of ground you up and spit you out. Once you were sent to someplace like Louisiana or Mississippi, you're not going to see your family again, and you're likely to have a very difficult life.
Would have been a horrible feeling, the separation from your spouse. How am I going to raise 6 children in an evil society?
You try and teach your children to have aspirations and that any dream they have can be attainable. To never be able to give that to your child, to know that their legacy is hopelessness.
After the sale of my father by Mr. Newman, Dr. McPherson would no longer hire out my mother to him. She returned accordingly to his estate. He was far kinder to his slaves than the planters generally were, never suffering them to be struck by anyone.
But Dr. McPherson is a drinker, and he eventually dies when he falls off his horse in a stream and is too drunk to lift himself and drowns in less than a foot of water. One of the worst moments in the lives of anyone held in slavery is the moment of death of the slaveholder. Their family, more than likely, is going to be broken apart. Their family is going to be shattered.
McPherson's heirs hire an appraiser to inventory their father's stuff, and Josiah is listed in that inventory as being 9 years old. He is listed as sick, and he is valued at $30. He, along with the rest of his family, will be sold at auction to the highest bidder.
Josiah holds his mother's hand and watches as his older brothers and sisters are sold off.
Josiah's mother is purchased by a very mean local blacksmith named Isaac Riley, and Josiah is the last of the Hensons to be forced up on the auction block.
Bids are starting to come in, and he sees his mother go to Isaac, fall to her knees, put her arms around his legs, and beg for her youngest child.
Please let me have one of my children. Just buy my baby, sir. And he kicks her.
I study women in slavery. I see this scenario over and over again. I have never read an account where it wasn't deeply heart-wrenching.
Henson was sold to a tavern owner by the name of Adam Robb, who was known in the county to be a brutal slave owner.
As we've looked through the records, we realize that Robb is speculating in children as a commodity.
He likes to buy them prepubescent, and then when they're early adolescents, he can sell them off as prime stock.
Adam Robb throws Josiah in his slave pen with all his other laborers, and they are so overworked that none of them care for him.
I was bought by a stranger named Rob, and truly a robber he was to me. He took me to his home and put me in the Negro quarters with about 40 others. all strangers to me. Nobody cared for me. The slaves were brutalized and had no sympathy for me. I soon fell sick and laid for some days almost dead on the ground. I became so feeble I could not move. In the course of a few weeks, Rob met Riley, who had bought my mother, and offered to sell me to him cheap.
Adam Robb, not wanting now to be stuck with a bad investment, trades Josiah to Isaac Riley for some horseshoeing work.
So that's the value of my great-great-great-grandfather's life, is a bucket of horseshoes.
The impression that I get of Isaac Riley is that he is a drunkard, that he is a man of low moral fiber or caliber.
He wanted to get every ounce of work out of the slaves.
He did not know how to really take care of his property, his business.
He is a man well suited for slavery, and he doesn't have a lot of moral misgivings.
Here on Riley's plantation, the crops will dictate the type of labor that's performed. Now in this area, we're leaving tobacco, and more of the crops here are more of your cereal grains, your corn, your wheat, your barley. They're fruit trees on the plantation.
Life on the Riley plantation, we have about 18 to 20 enslaved people there. Henson calls it the hut village, where the slave cabins were. There was a dirt floor, which when it rained became mud. There was no furniture, but the rain and the snow would come through the cracks of the log cabin.
So from a very small child, your duties become taking care of household things, bringing in wood for fireplaces. You have a number of fireplaces just within the master's house. So as soon as you are out from your mother's skirt, you're helping to collect vegetables from the garden. You are put to work. There really isn't a childhood.
Because he's younger, he starts off doing some things in the home, works his way up to being able to then work in the fields once he gets old enough.
And he grows into a big, strong, strapping man, which means he grows into a very valuable person.
Henson is perhaps his best worker because that's who he strived to be. I mean, he was always enslaved. That's a life that he knew, but he took pride in the work that he did.
And one day he catches his overseer stealing from his master. He reports this to Riley, and Isaac fires the man.
And Josiah is put in his place, and it saved them the funds of having to hire an outside white man to run it.
This makes Josiah very proud. He feels very good about having this opportunity and this responsibility. One of the advantages that he sees as the overseer is that he will take a chicken or a pig out into the woods and kill it and share it with the enslaved workers.
To steal to survive required an incredible degree of ingenuity and cunning. But the slaves had an interesting take. One way they looked at it was that property could not steal property.
He knows that in order for them to produce better as workers, they need to be fed.
Not only does he oversee the other slaves, but he also becomes Isaac's market man. He travels around 12 miles to Georgetown in Washington to sell all of the farm's produce.
Josiah Henson can neither read nor write, and yet he's doing all the marketing and he's doing all of the money exchange.
They had a nickname for him. Some would call him Saya, some would call him Cy. Here comes our boy Cy.
Think of the hustle and bustle going on. Washington, D.C. is a prime area where you can escape. You have a mix of free blacks, you have a mix of those who are enslaved, you have a mix of pro and anti-slavery, really sympathizers, and those who he could find assistance to escape. So he doesn't take on these opportunities that become available to him that we, with our 21st century eyes, would look and say, leave, look, it's right there. There's a boat. Someone will help you. They'll hide you. He had responsibilities. He had duties that bind him back to this area. And those are things that he takes great pride in.
So it was very common on the weekends for plantation owners to go into the Rockville taverns, play cards, watch some cockfights, and they would bring an overseer with them as their bodyguard.
They all knew that they would be in such a state at the end of these get-togethers that they wouldn't be able to get home in really great shape.
Often at these gatherings, these men would get into drunken brawls, and it was part of Josiah's job to get Riley out of these fights. This was the part of his job that he really enjoyed. It was theoretically one of the only times that a slave could rough up a white man. Unfortunately, things went very wrong one evening when Isaac got in a fight with 12 other men.
He was cornered, and a dozen were striking at him with fists, crockery, chairs, and anything that came handy.
Henson has to really sort of throw people around to get in there to get Riley out of the situation.
In the middle of this melee, a neighboring white overseer named Bryce Litton hits the deck. And Josiah doesn't know whether it's because maybe he hit him a little too hard or maybe because the man was really drunk, but either way, this overseer harbors a very serious grudge.
So about a week later, Josiah is on a horse with some letters to mail. He sees Litton there with some enslaved workers.
Litton forces Josiah off of his horse, and it immediately bolts as Litton makes the three men attack Josiah.
Now, Josiah's a big man, and he's young, and he's holding his own, but it's now 4 against 1.
Bryce takes a beam about 6 or 7 feet long, tries to hit Josiah over the head. It's blocked by his right arm, which is broken.
He falls to the ground and they continue to kick him and beat him.
Litton takes the fence post and he pile drives it again and again into Josiah's back, and he breaks both of his shoulder blades.
I think it's so difficult for us today to comprehend the torture that they went through, and being seen as nothing more than a dog or a mule on the plantation with no feeling, no emotion. That mentality, I don't think I'll ever understand.
The only way that the family realizes there's a problem is because the horse comes home, that riderless horse, always a sign.
They go looking for Josiah, and they find him. His face is all bloodied, and they bring him back to the house.
You can imagine every jolt in the road would be felt by him. He says he can hear it in his ears, the sounds of his shoulder blades grinding against one another because they're broken. Isaac Riley's sister has some kind of medical knowledge. She is called to sort of bind up his wounds as best she can.
Isaac Riley sues Bryce Litton for destruction of property.
Henson was not able to testify because in those days it was illegal for blacks to enter testimony into the legal court system. And unfortunately, Isaac Riley lost that case and ended up having to pay court costs and fines, which I can't imagine went over well on the plantation.
He's off for about 5 months recuperating. He's not able to do his general duties in the field.
And the first time he's out with a plow, it hits a rock, and the vibration up his arm breaks his collarbone, and so he's out again.
For the rest of his life, Josiah can never raise his hands above his head.
By 1825, Josiah's master was plagued with debts.
In this time period, there's debtor's prison. Going in debt is a crime against society.
And at some point, his slaves are going to be taken away from him and sold out from under him to pay a debt.
Isaac Riley is an incredibly litigious individual, and I've been able to find over a dozen lawsuits, including one with his own brother-in-law, and that one in particular precipitates Isaac Riley's ruin.
Long after I had fallen asleep, he came into my cabin. He began to groan and wring his hands. My heart was full of compassion at his wretched appearance. At last he cried, "Oh, sigh. I'm ruined, ruined."
Riley knows that Henson is a man of his word, and he doesn't break a promise.
Isaac Riley sets him up, he begs and pleads and extracts a promise from Henson before Henson knows what he's promising.
He says, "I need you to take the enslaved people here, except your mother, to my brother Amos's plantation 700 miles away to Kentucky."
He understands the level of integrity of the man and he uses it.
And he says, "If you don't, I'm going to sell everybody away from their families further south."
This was a pure asset protection scam in which Isaac was trying to get his possessions outside of the Maryland court system so they couldn't be seized.
The plan was to get out of Maryland as fast as you can in the dead of winter.
And so he agrees to this, not that he has much option.
Within 2 days, they were ready to go, men, women, and children.
The dread of being separated and sold away down south united us as one man. On we went through Alexandria, Culpeper, Cumberland, and over the mountains to Wheeling. I sold the horse and wagon and purchased a large boat that floated us steadily along.
Landing in Cincinnati on the other side of the Ohio River, they were on free soil.
The Ohio River was referred to as the River Jordan, in the sense that once you crossed the Ohio River, you were believed to be in freedom. And for a whole lot of people, that was the case.
There's a very strong free Black community in Cincinnati. And they basically look at Josiah Henson and, "What are you doing?"
You don't have to carry on. You don't have to go where you're going. You're in a safe place.
You have these people who are held in slavery, and you're conducting them back into slavery?
Let these slaves go.
He had never thought about running away to earn his freedom. To always be looking out over your shoulder, to always be a fugitive from the law, is not something that they wanted to be.
His station in life is one as a slave. He belongs to someone else. That's all he's ever known. That's all his mother's ever known. And so you make the best of that situation.
Henson believed in being a man of his word and being true to his masters. And he gave him his word and he was going to honor it.
He has a strong moral center. There's a right way and there's a wrong way to live your life.
When he says he could feel his own resolve weakening, he loads them all on a boat. He gets them out of Cincinnati as fast as he can, and he delivers them to Amos Riley in Kentucky.
That would have been his grandest opportunity to free himself, his wife, the 18 slaves, but he makes the commitment.
And I often wonder whether or not the fact that his mother was still on Isaac Riley's plantation, whether that entered his mind. What would happen to his mother?
Josiah did the best he knew at the time, but looking back, he said it was the greatest mistake of his life.
The Amos Riley plantation was the largest in the county, and there was 80 to 100 slaves working that plantation.
Because he's been referred by Isaac to Amos as a person who is capable of operating in an overseer's capacity, he quickly works his way back up to that position again.
And one day he meets a Methodist minister who convinces him that he could be a really good preacher, and he soon becomes admitted in the Methodist Episcopal Church.
News came from the Isaac Riley plantation that his financial situation was deteriorating.
And he tells Amos to sell all of his enslaved workers, except don't sell Josiah and his family.
Josiah is gripped with the pain. I had the opportunity back in Cincinnati, Ohio, to set the 18 slaves free. Josiah witnesses again the horrible separation of slaves being auctioned all over the country.
Josiah realizes how fragile life is in the hands of the Riley brothers, and his Methodist preacher friend comes up with a plan.
You know, you should think about purchasing your freedom.
Talk to Amos and see if he will allow you to go back and visit Isaac.
Let me introduce you to people that I know. Let me get you some interactions with congregations.
But he has to get Amos's permission to go back to Maryland, and so he broaches the subject one morning while giving his master a straight razor shave.
He starts talking to Amos about how he wants to go back to Maryland. And every time Amos tries to interrupt, he brings the brush close to his mouth so he can't speak, so that Josiah can get his full request out.
He was very clever and resourceful, and he knew when to push the limits.
And so it is agreed. He's given a pass to go to Maryland, but also to come back to Kentucky.
And on the way, as he's preaching to different groups, it's presented that he's trying to earn his freedom.
In this time period, this is a method of fundraising.
A new era opened upon me. I made my appeal with eloquence. I was pleading an issue of life and death, and those that heard me felt this in their hearts. The contrast between the respect with which I was treated and the ordinary abuse of plantation life gratified me in the extreme.
By the time Josiah moves across the country, he's earned enough money to change his clothes. He's been persuaded that, you have to look the part, you must dress the part. He has a fine horse.
Before I left Ohio, I was master of $275.
Isaac Riley is surprised to see him.
He's astounded by Josiah's appearance.
And he's also angered because nothing galls white slaveholders more than to see Black capacity. He makes him sleep on the dirt floor in the kitchen with dozens of other people.
Josiah looks around the cabin and he knows no one, and he learns that his mother has died in his absence. Everything that has connected him to this property is gone. Josiah stays awake almost all night, and at first light, he begins to negotiate for his freedom. But Isaac Riley drives a hard bargain, and they eventually arrive at a price, $450.
So he sells his horse and some of his clothes, and he comes back to Isaac, and he gives him $350.
They agreed to sign a promissory note that if you raise $100 more, you will be free.
And the news is already back in Kentucky when Josiah Henson returns.
He sees Charlotte, his wife, and he says, Charlotte, I'm gonna be a free man. And she goes, oh no, Si. I heard Massa Amos say your price was $1,000.
At which point it dawns on Henson what has happened.
They added another zero on what he owed. So he goes to Amos, and Amos confirms, yes, you owe $650. How are you gonna earn that, Si?
My heart would just sink. Here I've done all this preaching, traveling miles, and now you guys trick me.
No matter what he does, no matter how beneficial his labor is to these two brothers, he's never going to earn his freedom. They're just going to keep up in the ante every time.
He's been trying to be this honorable man with integrity inside of a system that will never allow that to be.
Amos comes to him and says, I'm going to send my son, Amos Jr., with this year's crops to be sold in New Orleans. And you're so good at negotiating prices and getting the best deals. I'd like you to go with him.
And Josiah is doubtful about this. He's wondering, am I going to be sold? And as he says goodbye to Charlotte and his children, he's wondering if this is the last time he's going to see them. They start their journey going down the Mississippi River.
When they reached Vicksburg, Mississippi, Josiah got permission to visit some of his friends who had been sold south from Kentucky.
And when he got to the plantation in Vicksburg, he was horrified to see these starving, emaciated, ragged people waiting to die.
They tell him they're working in malarial swamps, that there are gnats and mosquitoes all over, and they tell him it is hell.
He felt that it was an unforgivable thing that he had done to them, because he now saw firsthand what it meant to be sold south.
And he says he lost God.
In my own life, I've had those moments I think every human being has, where in the darkest of night, the unreasonable suddenly becomes reasonable to you.
One night, Josiah sees an axe, and he decides that he is going to kill everyone on board. The captain, the crew, Amos Jr. He's going to sink the ship, and he's going to escape north.
And he says to himself, this is how I can get my freedom. This is how I can avoid this fate.
This is my one shot. I'm probably not going to get too far because I'm further south than I've ever been.
If I go to New Orleans, I'm a dead man. I'm lost. I'm gone into slavery. Here's my one opportunity.
He grabs the axe and he goes into the ship and he comes to the first body, and it's a sleeping Amos Jr. And he looks at the young man and he raises the axe.
And he says he hears in his head, almost like an audible voice, "Murderer? You're going to be a murderer."
He's horrified that he has been pushed to this point.
Josiah shrinks back into the shadows, and he decides that he would rather die as a slave than live as a murderer.
So New Orleans is the largest slave market in the antebellum South and in the United States. More men, women, and children were bought and sold in the New Orleans markets than anywhere else. There were banks here in the city of New Orleans, Citizens Bank is a good example, that were known as property banks. And their reason for being was to underwrite mortgages in land and slaves. You could get a mortgage on a person in the same way that you could get a mortgage on a piece of property or a house. Buying what was known as a prime field hand, someone who is in their prime with many years of labor in front of him, was a very expensive endeavor. If you're talking about paying $1,500 for someone in 1850, that equivalent now is about $37,000. The domestic slave trade really reached into all facets of the American economy, and not simply the New Orleans economy or the Southern economy. Industries across the country and even transatlantically were involved in supporting the domestic slave trade. And this includes industries such as banking, insurance, taxation authorities. So you have cities and states, people are property, and what do you pay? When you own property, you pay taxes. Also, the clothing industry, the textile industry, the very same cotton that is being picked by enslaved Africans in the South. Some of that cotton is going to northern mills where it's being turned into very cheap cloth that is then sold back south to clothe enslaved laborers. Slave sales in New Orleans took place throughout the city. It could happen in a tavern, in a coffee house. It might happen on the streets, in slave pens, and even under the domed rotunda of a luxury hotel like the St. Louis Hotel.
And they go to New Orleans, and they unload the produce.
And he knows that after Amos Riley has disposed of all the other goods, there's only one last piece of business to transact, and that is the sale of Josiah Henson.
traders would have begun preparing enslaved people for market. And that meant cleaning them up. It meant, in some cases, applying blacking to people's hair to cover up the gray to make them look younger. It would have meant forced exercise for enslaved people to build muscle tone. It would have meant giving enslaved people a better diet to help them recover from their travels to the city of New Orleans.
Several planters came to the boat to look at me. I was sent on some hasty errand that they might see how I could run.
And then the final portion of preparing someone for market or turning people into products is the issuance of new suits of clothing.
Josiah is pleading with Amos, please, please, please don't sell me.
I tried every possible means to move his heart. Sometimes he would shed tears and say he was sorry for me, but still I saw his purpose was unchanged. His conscience evidently troubled him. He knew he was doing a cruel and wicked thing.
During that night, though, as Providence would have it, Amos falls sick, deathly ill.
Amos Jr. comes down with malaria.
And he very quickly deteriorates.
In a complete turn of the tables, Amos now needs Josiah.
And he's begging Josiah to care for him.
Josiah loads him into the sick bay, and they travel 12 days back up the Ohio River to the landing in Kentucky.
Oh, my heart sang jubilees of praise as the steamboat swung into the mighty tide of the Mississippi. Away from this land of bondage and death, away from misery and despair.
You can imagine Amos Sr.'s surprise when he sees Josiah Henson.
Josiah thought that saving a man's child, taking care of him when he was sick, and bringing him back to his family safe and healthy would cause the family to say, oh, what a good job you did. We will honor you with your freedom.
Henson is waiting for his accolades, you know. I've done something good. I've saved your son's life. I have been faithful.
But instead, they used that as a way to say he had additional skills. Therefore, he's more valuable as a slave. We could get a higher price for him now because he has empathy for white people.
So Josiah, by this point, has had enough of the Rileys, and he goes to Charlotte and he says to her, we need to get out of here.
The first step is he has to convince Charlotte to go, and she's terrified at the prospect. At least we know how to live this life. We know what to expect. That's an unknown we don't know how to negotiate.
He has looked slavery in the South in the eye. She has not.
A question that I'm often asked is why more enslaved people did not run away. And the simple answer is, where are they going to run? There are systems in place to keep you where you are. Most enslaved people in the United States were prohibited from learning how to read and write, prohibited from reading maps. Some were prohibited from learning how to swim. You have slave patrols with dogs. This is the precursor to the Southern police force. Punishments for escaping or running away varied. It depended on the circumstance, but they may have included being forced to wear iron collars, and each prong bore a bell. And the idea here was not only to create discomfort by forcing someone to wear a 4 to 6 pound iron collar, but also to have that person's movements tracked. Of course, whippings, brandings, and very severe repeat instances of running away. Someone may have had their foot cut off, their toes cut off. Punishments for runaways really depended on the overseer or the owner.
What Josiah Henson finally does is he talks to his wife and starts to lay out an escape plan.
Now they have 4 children, 4 boys, 12, 10, 3, and 2.
He's pretty steadfast. Like, if you're not going to do this, I'm taking the children and I'm going without you.
I think that again harkens back to that pivotal, formative moment in his mind as a child when he sees his family being sold. He's bound and determined that they're going together.
Eventually, she comes around.
Charlotte makes Josiah a backpack for the 2 youngest children to be harnessed on his shoulders.
And for 2 weeks, he practices with the 2-year-old and the 3-year-old in this knapsack on his back so that they know how to sit and he knows how to walk with his healed, broken bones on his shoulders.
It was very rare for slaves to escape with their family. It was usually single black men, but Josiah was committed to taking his wife and children with him.
So the plan is that they're going to go to Canada, where slavery is illegal. He does not trust the whole system with the passes and all this. He wants to get to Canada.
I resolved to start on Saturday. Sunday was a holiday. On Monday and Tuesday, I was to be away at farms distant from the house. Several days would elapse, and by that time, I would have a good start.
Josiah's family travels through the woods by night for 10 days, and they eventually run out of food. And Josiah has to take to the high road during daylight to find them some sustenance.
So he harbors them in a little wooded area and approaches a farmhouse. And at first he's denied.
And then he goes to another house. The man says no, but his wife says yes. And she gives him some venison.
And when he comes back to his family, they're thrilled. But the food was heavily salted, and they were then suffering from extreme thirst.
So he goes to a stream and he puts some water in his hat, but that doesn't work.
I took off both shoes, which luckily had no holes in them, rinsed them out, filled them with water, and carried it to my family. Never did I see any human being relish anything more than my poor, famished little ones did, that refreshing draught out of their father's shoes.
He does eventually come into Cincinnati. He rendezvous with his friends there. What they neglect to tell him is that the way is completely overgrown. Nothing but bramble and thicket, and there's no inhabitants.
We lay down at night, hungry and weary. The wolves were howling, and their noise terrified my poor wife and children. It was a hard trial. We went wearily on. We had not gone far when we discerned some persons approaching us at no great distance.
They encounter First Nations who had never seen Black people before.
And they're scared, and they run away.
The only thing he can think to explain is that maybe they think he's the devil. But he's shocked that they don't realize the devil doesn't travel around with his wife and children.
And Charlotte is terrified. She thinks that they're going to come back with a war party and kill them all. And Josiah says, they could have killed us. It's 4 against, 4 children and 2 adults. No, we need to move on. All of a sudden, the Native Americans come back and bring them to their village.
Eventually, he enters into a dialogue of sorts with the chief, and they're taken in.
They have a common kinship because they're both under the boot of the same oppressor, the white man. They're given their own teepee, which must have seemed like a palace to them. They're given plenty of food, water, just the time to sort of rejuvenate their spirits and their physical capability to carry on.
The Native Americans actually show them the way that they can get to Sandusky and continue on their travels.
Josiah's family makes it to a little town west of Sandusky called Venice Village. He hides his family in the bushes and he ventures down to the port.
And he sees a Black worker and he says to him, "Are you a slave?" He goes, "No, I'm free." And the captain yells out to him, "Hey, do you want to work?" Josiah says yes, and then as he gets closer, the captain looks at him, and whether it's because of his shoulder or the blood from the knapsack rubbing, he says, "Well, you can't work." And Josiah says, "Yes, I can." And he picks up one of the bags, and he spends the day working, and he earns some money. But during the course of this, he tells the captain what is happening and where his family is and how they're trying to get to Canada. And the captain comes up with a plan, and he says to him that once it gets dark, we can pick up your family, but we can't do it till then because there are slave catchers along the shore from Kentucky looking for runaways.
You gather up your wife and your children. I'll bring the boat around to where you are.
As Henson watches the boat disappear into the horizon, he thinks, oh no, I've been tricked again.
But true to his word, the captain brings the ship back into harbor under cover of night and sends a rowboat with 3 men to help Josiah find his family.
Henson goes back. His wife and his children aren't there.
To my horror, they were gone from the place where I had left them. Overpowered with fear, I suppose they had been found and carried off. There was no time to lose. The men told me I would have to go alone.
I'm this close. And now it looks like failure is at hand.
Because he's been gone for so long, Charlotte has feared the worst and moved them to a place of greater safety.
Just at that point of despair, however, I stumbled on one of the children and soon discerned them in the fading twilight. And now we were off to the boat where a fine run brought us into Buffalo.
And now there is Canada well and truly right in front of them, visibly in front of them.
The captain says, "You see that land over there? Over there, you'll be a free man."
And after all of this arduous work, the treks that he's made, back and forth, he's looked at slavery in the eye and almost sold in New Orleans. He sees his fate, and finally the dream of his freedom that he has harbored for years and years comes true.
It's like the heavens would have opened that day. I died and went to Canaan land, which they called Canada.
The captain took Josiah and his family down to the riverside, and he paid the 3 shillings to the ferryman to take them across. But he asked him a question first.
"Are you going to be a good man?" He replies, "Yes, sir. I will use my freedom well."
On October 28, 1830, Josiah Henson's feet touch free soil for the first time.
You can picture it like a scene from a movie. He falls to the ground.
He rolls around in the dirt.
He grabs handfuls of sand and kisses them. He hugs his wife and children and dances around before a growing crowd of witnesses.
And they said, "This man is mad."
He jumps to his feet and says, "Oh no, don't you know? I'm free."
From that time to the present, I have been called Uncle Tom, and I feel proud of the title. If my humble words in any way inspired that gifted lady to write, I have not lived in vain, for I believe her book was the beginning of the glorious end.